What would you do if you found a newborn baby abandoned on the road and no one believed you? A lonely dirt road. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows over the dusty ground. Layla and Mia, both 5 years old, walked side by side, their small hands clasped tightly together. Their feet were bare, the rough road scraping against their tender soles. The dirt, mixed with sweat and the weight of the day, clung to their little bodies. They were 2 girls from a neighborhood where hope felt like a distant dream. Their home, a tiny, run-down apartment, was a place where the walls felt too thin, the ceilings too low, and the air too stale. Their parents, both hard-working but always struggling, worked long hours just to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Most days, Layla and Mia took care of themselves, figuring out how to get through the day while their parents tried to survive. Stick together no matter what. Their mama had told them more times than they could count. It was a rule, a mantra, something that kept them going when things were hard. Today was different. Today, there was no mama telling them what to do, no daddy making sure they had something to eat. Today, they were alone. Layla and Mia wandered down the dirt road, not fully understanding where they were going or why. They didn't have answers, only questions. Where was their mom? Why couldn't she be here? Was their dad coming home tonight? Their little faces were dusty, their clothes tattered. Layla wore a faded yellow dress that had once been bright, but now was stained and worn from too many days of use. Mia's overalls hung loosely on her thin frame, the straps barely staying up as she walked, her tiny feet kicking up dust with every step. They didn't have toys like the other kids in their neighborhood. No dolls to play with, no action figures, no plastic kitchen sets, just the street and the endless horizon ahead. The few things they owned didn't mean much, only enough to get by. But it didn't matter, because they had each other, and that was enough. They didn't even notice the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the sky. For them, time had no real meaning, just the feeling of walking, of hoping, of surviving another day. The world around them felt distant. Cars sped by on the road, the sounds of busy lives echoing in the distance. People walking, talking, living, but no one saw them. No one looked their way. No one bothered to stop and ask if they needed help. Their stomachs ached from hunger, but there was no food to be had. The thought of finding something to eat seemed impossible, like an unreachable star. Layla looked down at Mia, who was still holding her hand, gripping it tightly. She could feel the warmth of her sister's hand in hers, but it wasn't enough to ease the fear settling in her chest. They were lost. Lost in a world that seemed too big, too confusing, too harsh. And yet, Layla knew she had to stay strong. For Mia, for both of them. "Don't worry, Mia. We're going to be okay," Layla said softly, even though she wasn't sure if she believed it. But Mia, with her big brown eyes wide with confusion, only nodded. She trusted Layla. She always did. The 2 girls kept walking, each step uncertain, each turn unplanned. They didn't know where the road would take them, but they didn't stop. Because they couldn't. They couldn't stop walking, couldn't stop believing in something, anything, that could help them escape the endless cycle of poverty that had been their life so far. They only had each other, and that was all they needed. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment. It all began that morning when Layla and Mia, tired of the dusty streets of their trailer park, decided to explore the woods behind their home. The sun was already high in the sky. the heat making the air feel heavy and sticky. The world around them seemed so quiet, almost too quiet. As they wandered, the soft breeze rustled the trees, but that peaceful sound was soon interrupted by something far more urgent, a weak, pitiful cry. At first, they thought it was just an animal, but as they moved closer, the sound grew louder, more desperate. Layla, always the braver of the two, took Mia's hand and led her through the underbrush toward the sound. And then they saw it. There, lying on the cold ground, was a newborn baby. Wrapped in nothing but a thin, ragged blanket, the infant's face was a blotchy red, tiny fingers twitching as if trying to grasp at something that wasn't there. The baby's cries were faint, weak, but unmistakable, a human life clinging on. Mia gasped, her small hands trembling as she reached out. "Layla, what do we do?" Layla didn't have an answer, but the sight before them filled her with a sense of urgency that pushed aside any fear. Someone had abandoned the baby, left it alone in the woods, vulnerable. They had to act. Without saying a word, Layla carefully scooped up the fragile child, cradling him in her arms. "We have to get him help," she whispered, though the words seemed hollow. There was no one to call, no phone in her pocket, no adults to turn to. The girls looked around, the weight of the situation sinking in. The world around them, once so big and full of life, now felt empty and vast, stretching far beyond what they could handle alone. Mia, her face pale, hugged Layla tightly, her own hands still gripping the hem of her sister's tattered dress. She was scared, but Layla's strength gave her a sense of reassurance. "Let's go," Layla said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her chest. The two girls began walking slowly at first, then with growing urgency. Layla's arms ached, but she held on, knowing that the baby was depending on them. He was small, so small, and his life was fragile. They had to get him to safety, but where could they go? There were no homes nearby, no hospitals, no answers. The road they walked down led nowhere. They passed familiar sights, the dusty trailers they called home, the broken fences, the places they'd known their entire lives. But everything looked different now. Their world was now a road that stretched infinitely, and with each step, it felt like they were leaving behind the only life they knew. Tears stung Layla's eyes, but she refused to cry. She wasn't going to let fear stop them. She kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her small feet pushing forward, step after step. Mia followed, trusting her sister without question, her own small hands clutching the hem of Layla's dress for support. The weight of the child in Layla's arms made the road feel longer. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of responsibility was sinking deeper into her bones. But still, they walked. They had to. No one had prepared them for this. No one had taught them what to do in a situation like this. But instinct kicked in. They were alone. They had each other. And somehow they would make it. It felt like hours had passed, but the sky remained bright. The road stretched before them, winding and endless, and with each step they hoped they would find something, someone to help. The baby's cries grew softer, then stopped entirely, and Layla felt a pang of panic. She gently rocked him, whispering words of reassurance, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. The journey was just beginning, and with no clear destination in sight, Layla and Mia were about to learn just how far they were willing to go for a life they didn't even know. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Layla and Mia's legs ached, their tiny arms trembling from the weight of the baby they carried. Their steps had slowed, exhaustion settling into their bones, but they kept going, There was no other choice. They had no idea where they were headed, only that they couldn't stop now. The baby had fallen quiet in Layla's arms, his small body still and fragile, but she could feel the weight of his life in her hands. With each passing minute, they moved further from the safety of their neighborhood, unsure of what awaited them. Then, the sound they had been dreading for so long cut through the silence. Sirens, high-pitched, shrill, and growing louder by the second. Layla's heart skipped a beat as the red and blue lights flashed in the distance. Her stomach sank. She didn't know what to do. She didn't even know what was happening. The only thing she could focus on was the officer driving the car toward them. The vehicle rolled to a stop beside the girls, its engine idling as the officer inside looked them over. The door swung open, and a tall white officer stepped out, his uniform sharp against the setting sun. Officer Daniels. Layla had seen him around town before. He was known for being tough, for treating people like them. Black kids, poor, struggling differently. She had learned quickly to keep her distance. Now, her pulse quickened, her breath catching in her chest as he approached. "What are you two doing out here? Alone?" His voice was low, sharp, like he already suspected something was wrong. Layla gripped Mia's hand tightly, trying to hide her shaking fingers. We're just walking," she managed to say, her voice small, but she knew it sounded wrong. The officer frowned, scanning their faces like he didn't believe her. "Walking? Where are your parents?" His gaze was hard, unblinking. The suspicion in his voice made her feel small, like a criminal, though she hadn't done anything wrong. Her heart pounded harder as she tried to steady her breath, trying to find the right words, but none came. We don't have parents," Mia whispered, her voice trembling too. Officer Daniels didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, eyes now focused on the bundle in Layla's arms. His expression changed in an instant. His eyes darkened, narrowing in on the baby. "Where did you get that baby?" His tone shifted, colder now, more demanding. Layla swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. We found him," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Officer Daniels didn't move, but his body stiffened. His hand slowly moved toward his belt, fingers brushing against the holster. Layla froze, her stomach tightening, dread rising in her chest. She could feel Mia shaking beside her, her small body trembling with fear. "Oh, really?" Daniel's voice was low and menacing, his eyes never leaving the baby. Layla felt a wave of panic wash over her, but she kept her grip on Mia's hand. She had to stay strong. "Yes," she repeated, more firmly this time. "We found him. He was left all alone in the woods." Daniels took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes were cold, his gaze searching their faces as though trying to find the truth in their words. He was towering over them now, his presence overwhelming, and Layla felt small, so small, as if she didn't matter at all. "Tell me the truth, right now," he demanded, his voice rising. The accusation in his words felt like a weight pushing down on her chest, suffocating her. Layla opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She wasn't lying. They hadn't done anything wrong. But somehow, the officer didn't believe them. She could see it in his eyes. He didn't trust them, didn't trust her, didn't trust anything about their lives. His suspicion was like a shadow over them, and it made her feel like she was trapped, stuck in a story she couldn't escape. Mia squeezed her hand tighter, her small fingers digging into Layla's skin, but Layla couldn't think of what to say next. Her mind raced, trying to come up with something that would make the officer see the truth, but it didn't seem like anything would work. The officer stood there, waiting for an answer, his eyes still locked on them, waiting for them to slip up, to show their guilt. Officer Daniels's expression hardened, his gaze shifting between the two girls and the baby in Layla's arms. His stance was rigid, imposing. The air between them grew thick with tension, each second stretching into eternity. You expect me to believe two little black girls just found a white baby in the middle of the road? His voice was cold, cutting. Layla's heart raced. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had to speak, had to make him understand. It's the truth. Please, Daniels didn't even let her finish. He whipped his hand to his radio, his finger pressing down on the button as he barked. I've got 2 juveniles in custody. Possible abduction. The words echoed in Layla's ears, and her throat tightened. The world around her seemed to tilt, the panic rising in her chest like a tidal wave. Mia's small body shook beside her, and before Layla could react, the tears started to fall. Mia's sobs racked her tiny frame, each cry breaking Layla's heart. No, we didn't take him. We were helping, Mia cried, her voice barely a whisper between sobs. She clutched Layla's hand desperately, her fingers slipping as her grip loosened with every cry. Layla tried to hold it together. She had to. For Mia, for the baby, for all of them. But fear was creeping in, spreading like wildfire. Her own eyes filled with unshed tears as she looked up at Officer Daniels, his face unreadable. The officer didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His eyes were locked on them, his mind made up. To him it was simple. 2 black girls, 1 white baby. Something didn't add up. And to him, that something was an assumption. You think I'm stupid, he muttered, stepping closer, his boots making a heavy thud with each step. He didn't care about their innocence, didn't care about the truth. He only cared about what he believed, what he saw. And in that moment, he saw only what he wanted to believe. Layla's legs were shaking. She was fighting the urge to break down. She had to protect Mia. She had to protect them both. Please, sir, Layla said, her voice barely a whisper, but it felt like a scream in her head. We just found him. We're trying to help. Please, you have to believe us. But Daniels wasn't listening. The decision had already been made in his mind. Without another word, he reached for his cuffs. Layla's breath caught in her throat. He was going to arrest them, just like that. For trying to save a life. For trying to do the right thing. No, please don't, Layla cried, pulling Mia closer, but it was too late. Daniels was already pulling the cuffs from his belt, his hands moving swiftly. Mia's cries grew louder, the sound piercing the cold air, but Daniels didn't react. His eyes were cold, unfazed. The moment had shifted. This wasn't about the truth anymore. This was about power, about control. And in that moment, Layla felt powerless. The baby in her arms stirred, but she couldn't comfort him. She couldn't comfort Mia. All she could do was watch as the officer's hand reached for her wrist, ready to snap the cuffs on. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she refused to let them see her break. She wouldn't let Daniels win. Not like this, please, please, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But it was drowned out by Mia's frantic cries. The sirens in the distance seemed to grow louder. The scene was unfolding like a nightmare. 2 young girls, accused of something they didn't do. But there was no one to listen, no one to defend them. The world had already decided what they were, even before they had a chance to explain. The screech of tires echoed through the quiet road, and before Officer Daniels could place the cuffs on Layla, a car pulled up fast. The sound of a door slamming shut made everyone turn. A woman, breathless and frantic, dashed toward them. Tears streamed down her face. "Oh, my God! My baby!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. Layla and Mia froze, eyes wide with confusion. The woman rushed past the officer, ignoring him entirely, and dropped to her knees in front of the stroller. She scooped the baby up, holding him tightly against her chest. Layla stepped back, still trembling, trying to process what was happening. The mother's hands shook as she cradled the baby, looking down at him in disbelief. "Where did you find him?" she asked, voice cracking. "I've been looking everywhere. Please tell me." Layla opened her mouth to speak, but the words got stuck. Finally, she managed. He was alone, in the woods. We just found him there." The mother's face drained of color. Her eyes widened in horror. She grabbed the baby even tighter. "The woods?" she gasped. "Oh, my God!" Her hands shook uncontrollably as she pulled out her phone, quickly dialing something with frantic fingers. "It was my boyfriend. He threatened to take my baby," she explained, her voice shaking. "He said he was going to hurt him, and then he just disappeared. I didn't know where he was, where he had taken him." The words hung in the air, and for the first time Officer Daniels was silent. His gaze shifted from the baby in the mother's arms to the girls standing in front of him, their faces filled with confusion and fear. His entire body stiffened, and his eyes narrowed as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been so sure of his assumptions. And now, all of it, the harsh words, the cold judgment, the cuffs he had almost put on them, felt like a mistake. The truth was staring him in the face, and it was more painful than anything he had ever expected. The girls weren't kidnappers. They were heroes. The weight of his prejudice pressed down on him. He looked at Layla and Mika again, this time differently, more carefully. He could see the fear and confusion in their eyes, but there was also something else. Something that made him wish he could take back the last few minutes. He slowly lowered his hands. The authority he'd once felt slipped away, replaced by regret. He took a deep breath, swallowing hard as he knelt down in front of Layla and Mia. You really found him?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze was softer now, his eyes searching theirs for an answer. There was no judgment in his words this time, only a flicker of understanding. Layla nodded, still shaking. "We just wanted to help," she whispered. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. For the first time in his life, Officer Daniels realized how wrong he had been. His assumptions about these two little girls, based on nothing more than their race and the situation, had clouded his judgment. He had almost ruined their lives. He had almost ruined everything because he had assumed the worst. Officer Daniels' expression shifted, his shoulders sagging as he let out a slow, regretful breath. The realization of his own prejudice hit him hard. He almost destroyed two innocent lives without knowing the truth. The mother held the baby close, her sobs quieting, but her face still pale from the panic of the past hours. She whispered her thanks to the girls, her voice full of gratitude. As Officer Daniels stood up, he cast a final look at Layla and Mia. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but full of regret. He had never imagined that a moment like this could change him, but it had. In that split second, his perception of the world had been forever altered. The girls weren't criminals. They weren't thieves. They were good kids. Kids who had saved a life. And for the first time in his career, Officer Daniels saw the impact of his actions in a way he never had before, and he knew, deep down, that he could never go back to seeing the world through the same lens again. The mother, still holding her baby tightly, wiped away the last of her tears and turned toward the girls. Her voice was shaky, but full of gratitude. "You saved my son's life," she said softly, her eyes filled with emotion. Before Layla and Mia could respond, the woman pulled them into a tight hug. It was the first time in a long while that someone had shown them warmth, kindness. Layla and Mia stood there, frozen for a moment, their tiny bodies overwhelmed by the sudden affection. The years of feeling invisible, of being overlooked, seemed to melt away in that embrace. Officer Daniels stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. His hands were still at his sides, his face solemn. He had witnessed the power of assumptions before, but never like this. Never had he seen so clearly how a few seconds of judgment could alter lives, his own included. As he observed the girls being held by the woman, something shifted in him. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him. Slowly, he removed his hat and stepped forward. The words he needed to say seemed heavy in his mouth, but they came out steady, sincere. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I was wrong." Layla looked up at him, her small face full of quiet strength. "You thought we were bad, didn't you?" Her words were calm, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes, a sadness she had learned to carry for years. Daniels swallowed hard. "Yeah, I did." The confession was like a weight lifted from his chest, and for the first time, he didn't feel like the authority in the room. He was just a man, standing in front of two children who had shown him more humanity than he had ever imagined. "And I was wrong." There was a long pause. Layla and Mia exchanged a look, both of them processing what had just happened. And then, in a moment that felt like the closing of a chapter, they smiled. Not just at the officer, but at the world they had just stepped into, a world that had, for once, seen them for who they were. Not as troublemakers, not as threats, but as the heroes they had always hoped to be. The mother turned back to the girls, still holding the baby against her chest. "I'm so sorry for what you've been through," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she fished through her purse. She pulled out a wad of cash and pressed it into their hands. "For you, for your kindness." Layla and Mia looked at the money, hesitant, unsure. They didn't expect it. They had never been given anything just for doing something good. But in that moment, they accepted it, not out of greed, but because for the first time in their lives, someone saw them, truly saw them. As the officer watched them leave, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. The girls had acted without hesitation, not thinking about themselves, but only about the baby they had found. And he, someone who had spent years enforcing laws, had failed to see the truth in front of him. But now, as he watched the girls walk away, their small hands clutching the money, he understood something vital. Justice didn't always lie in the law. Sometimes it was in the humanity we show one another. And for the first time in a long while, Officer Daniels felt like he had learned something more important than any rule he had ever enforced. As the girls disappeared into the distance, safe and sound, Daniels took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that today, in that moment, something had shifted, both in him and in the world around him.